Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Hey, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. I know there are places that we don't want to be. And fortunately for us on this panel, I believe that we're all in a safe place. So please fasten your seatbelts, and thanks again, Mark, for leading us to this position, and also thanks to everybody for participating on this panel. As we know, we are bringing together the various continents around the world and following up on the milestone of the 600 Knowledge Seekers Workshop. So here we go. As we enter into a new type of teaching, this is Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. We are now moving into the advanced nanotech series. Today's discussion is the turning point. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is July the 27th, 2025. This is part of the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So we have been carrying on from the intermediate nanotech series. And as you can see, we discussed the point blank, inertia point, star point, Gans point, pico point, and dimension point. And I hope that leads one to the conclusion that we're trying to make a point. And we will continue because we now have a very important point to make, and that is the turning point. This is part of the advanced nanotech series. We've been trying to condense these teachings so that newcomers and mature knowledge seekers can take from it what they want, interpret it, and translate it into their own way, and then try and incorporate that in their own life, and then, of course, try and communicate with others in such a manner that we don't get discriminated or abused. Because what we're dealing with is bringing peace and prosperity to this planet. So, yeah, we are at a turning point, and it's very difficult for us to keep up because we're still at a very low energy state. Collectively, the Keshe Foundation is rapidly moving forward, and it's becoming increasingly more difficult to keep up. So, and of course, the gap between those who have no idea what's going on and have not been following the program at any point in the past 11 years, it becomes even more difficult. But there is a fast track, and so each and every one of us has a way to make the connection, and that's what we're trying to do. We're discussing the books of Meron Topokoli Keshe started with book number 1, which is the universal order of the creation of matter. And this is perfectly logical because it brings together the antimatter, dark matter, and the matter state in a scientific context. And so now we see how our tiny little perfect world was created. But what we don't know is where we came from and where we're going to. And so the book number 2, which involves the structure of the light, obviously it goes between two matter states, two universal creations of matter. And if it's going from one place to another, there has to be some other motive to do that. And all we see is the physical part. And then, of course, there's book number 3, which is the origin of the universe, and all of a sudden it's disclosing a non-physical part. So we have a sister universe that is complementing our universe, what we call man's universe. The problem with man's universe is that our domain that we take on a daily basis is a tiny drop within a drop, and it's a very, very small spot. And it's very difficult to see when you look at it in the context of what's going on. And for many of us, that's all we're allowed to see. We just can't seem to stop to see everything else that's going on, because in terms of the practical application, it doesn't fit in with what we're doing on a daily basis. So what we are trying to do on a daily basis, of course, is to understand what is our purpose on this planet. And for 387 weeks, the One Planet, One Nation, One Race for Justice and World Peace has been brought to you by Rick Crammon and the members of the Universal Council to understand that we are all part of the humanity race and we're all living on this planet. And it's kind of like our home. And when we have discord, then you understand what that means in your own home. And for instance, I know of one home, which I couldn't believe, but the couple were planning for a divorce and they literally drew a line down the middle of the home, literally. And one was on one side and the other was on the other side, and there was no way you were allowed to cross. And then, of course, that involved lawyers, and we all understand how that process works. So uh, we would summarize that as a very stressful situation, and of course, it's really a lose-lose situation. What we're looking at is a win-win situation. So in order for us to understand that, we have to eliminate the discord that we have on this planet, because it comes around from not understanding the plasma rule, where the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. So this is in stark contrast to the business rule or the Darwinian rule, where the higher strength eats the weaker strength. Either way, it becomes a conflict point. And so that conflict point can be interpreted in many ways. It could be a war zone, or it could be a binding zone, or it could be an interaction zone. But that zone is a manifestation zone, and it's all part of the inertia density manifestation, which we call physicality. And the problem with physicality is we just don't see what everything else is going on here. So we like to keep books. We are bookkeepers. We have business and life, and we have income and expenses and profit and loss. But what we don't know is who is the author of this book, and are we allowed to supplant that author, and are we allowed to alter the income and the expenses? And when we apply that with respect to nuclear science, we can see that the gravitational income minus the magnetical expense equals the inertia point. And that point is wherever you are. And so we are all on a different path, our path, individual path, and it's a unique path. And yet we are all part of the same planet, which is on one path. So here we are, independent variables on a singular physical point. So, how do we navigate that? Do we have any control over that? Well, energy binding for self-serving purposes is very important for us to determine a dimension point. And we have to remember that we were born. And in that remembrance, we had to remember that that energy binding was self-serving. That's how we were born. And at that point, that was our physical dimension point. And at that point, we weren't taking that energy at the expense of others. So somehow in our lifetime, we have acquired a new way of energy binding, and we do it at the expense of others. So when others are dependent on that energy binding for self-serving purposes, and they are being further depleted, not only by the lack of understanding of how we created the dimension point in the first place, but when we have others lying, cheating, and stealing from us, and then we are even more deficient. And then, of course, we either fight back or we do the domino effect and lie, cheat, and steal to others and steal their energy binding. And so we see different forms of maladies taking over this planet. And so we call this the action of the fallen angels because in mathematics we talk about angular density. And angular density implies a falling. Now we call that gravity, but what it really is increased density. And when you do that, you also increase pressure. So that is increased gravity. That falling is an increased gravity, and mathematically, that's the angular momentum, which equals the moment of inertia times the angular velocity. Okay, well, that's all fine and dandy. What is really important is to understand that this angular momentum is conserved. And so what does that mean? That means you're neither eliminating or creating energy. Energy is always in motion. It is abundant everywhere. And so how do you move it around? And so there are rules of conservation. And this is what we need to take into account. And can we do that in our tiny little perfect worlds? So we're discussing the turning point today because what we have to understand is that there is a source of the service. And in that source, we can either turn this point of service back or we can turn it forward. But in order to be able to do that, we have to have the binding energy first. And so that gives us a very singular point of view. And that's why we've achieved this turning point, because as we're progressing, we understand that we were given 10 commandments, not being allowed to question as to who gave us these commandments and why doesn't my dog have these commandments. But now we find out that there's another 14 missing commandments. And the real commandment, like for me in particular, that is most important, and I keep referencing, is thou shalt not lie. And the reason this is important is because poker playing is a fascinating game that people like to play. And then, of course, the result of that game is that there's only one winner and everybody else is a loser. And then, of course, it's not a really good way to make friends. And so, you know, at the start of the game, there may be a lot of camaraderie, but, you know, it's kind of like Russian roulette. You know, 5 out of 6 doctors love Russian roulette. And so which part are you? And the trouble, of course, is that this is a game that we play with others. But many of us play that game with ourselves. And that is a real loser's game, because when you're lying to yourself, well, you have to be pretty skillful to fool yourself. And interestingly enough, many do. I didn't think that was possible, and I got fooled in that process as well. But that is a detriment to our vitality. So with the Universal Body Enhancement Unit, what we're doing is promoting vitality enhancement. And in terms of that vitality, we're talking about life forces and the quality of the life forces. So there are two aspects that are very important for us. So one is the physical aspect, which we all love because we love to build our bodies and we love to look at beautiful bodies. And then, of course, that affects us emotionally. And then, of course, our activity affects us emotionally. And so that is very good with respect to our physical presence. But that doesn't account for our existence, which actually involves more than our physical presence, because that physical presence is important in any relationship, but that bond is transcending that physical relationship. So if you have a relationship, there is no rope that is binding you together, as in, shall we say, a tug of war. So how come we are having a tug of war? And who is doing the tugging and who is doing the winning? Well, we are all winners because we all came here successfully. And now, as we try and navigate on the transmission highway, forgetting that we got here on the transmutation highway, and forgetting, of course, that we will be leaving the same way. So, how can we stay on the transmutation highway and still enjoy our physicality? Or shall we say, can the physicality navigate on the transmutation highway? And is that possible? So we find that when we talk about elevation in simple terms, we start with the basic frequency generation at the carbon 12 level, and we move up to the transition state at the carbon 14 level. And then, of course, there's the transmutation state, which goes up to the carbon 16 level. And then we discover that there is a connectivity, there's a consistency. And that consistency is carbon, which is really consistent with the fact that things that are carbon-based are organic, and we are organic. So there is a consistency there. That's very fortunate. On the other hand, there's an inorganic, which is silicon-based. But interestingly enough, as we find that silicon and carbon are actually of the same family. So there is a commonality there. And then, of course, the Earth is our inorganic home, and we are the organic components of that home. And we work together and look at the result. Are you satisfied? And so we ran into a dilemma, and it was called the pandemic. Well, the cups of life were not named cups of the pandemic, they were named the cups of life. Why is that? Well, because it enhances through the nanocoding process of the monatomic science, which we're talking about the advanced nanotech now. And we saw that each and every one of us was able to dabble in advanced nuclear science, where we were able to create gases that were emotional and physical, and it gave us a strength, both emotional and physical strength. And so we were able to create many cups of life. And these all represented a radiance manifestation, such as CO2 or calcium or zinc or copper, water or amino acid. And then, of course, now we're able to create gold GANs, and heaven help those who are invested in the price of gold today and unaware of the reality of the situation. And then, of course, there's the cup of the soul. And what is interesting is that every one of these cups, be it the cup of the soul, the cup of the emotion, or the cup of physicality, has a magnetical gravitational relationship. And then within that is the soul. And then when we bring these collectively together, then the entire component has a magnetical gravitational relationship. So it works as a collective soul, and therefore it manifests a soul as well. So it operates in unison. And when we say as unison, all on the same track, but of course we know that there are multitasking tracks, singularity, duality, and then of course we go into the multiple dimensions. And then we have the cup of the universe, which is what we're all tracking. And we have the copper gans, which represents our physical well-being, and the zinc gans, which represents our emotional well-being. And then, of course, we have the carbogen, which is our connection to the rest of the universe. And so we say that mind is the builder, but where did that come from when we consider that the basis of the brain is calcium? So we find that there is another cup, and it works differently from our physicality. And so we have this duality. We're working with the connection to the universe, and we're also working with the connection to our beautiful earthly planet. And of course, our earthly planet has a grand central station of many earth ganses, and each of one of these is available. We can produce ganses of each element, and all the elements on the periodic table of element are represented by these earth ganses. And we find that we have this affinity for earth. And we know that for a fact because we were born on earth. We weren't born on Mars or Jupiter. We were born on earth. So we had a natural selection at that point. And so we find that there is an affinity between the earth ganses and our physicality. And so that is why this is our home. And one of the most important things that we all know is about the gold. And so now we're in the era beyond the Beijing conference in May, where we were actually able to take these reactors. And so we noticed that we had 2 reactors working in unison. And within the reactors, we had multiple ganses working in unison. So that's unison within unison working as unison. And we were able to literally create gold out of thin air. And as we know, in our society, men are not the only gold diggers. And so this is a universal concept. And it all comes about from us understanding, and we've been talking about the nanotech. And so that means the nano alignment that comes as a result of basic nano coating of a copper wire. We find that we can nano coat anything. And so we create this carbon nanocrystal, and then we create this field alignment, and then we have a convergence of energy coming in, which we can differentiate between the gravitational inertia point at the core and the magnetical inertia point surrounding that and creating a field. And therefore, that becomes our range. And then we have to understand the concept of the twinity, where we have 2 points of the nanotech. And that nanotech is small, but then we have 2 points of the picotech, which is even smaller. And then, of course, we have the 2 points of the star tech. And now we have the twinity of the nanotech, which actually amplifies everything again. Obviously, 2 is twice as much as 1, but we can add more and we can get the compounding effect of the benefit. And so to understand levels of magnitude as we've been adding to this picture, and maybe it's getting a little bit cluttered, but we find that there's a certain kind of oneness. And from that oneness, we can get larger into mega, giga, and tera. We've heard those terms. And we are in the plasma science, which goes into micro, nano, and pico, and gets much smaller. And an order of magnitude is 10 times. So when we're talking about mega, as in million, it has 6 zeros. So it's 10 to the power of 6. And when we're talking about micro, that's 1 millionth. So that's 10 to the minus 6. Well, we have transcended to nano, which is minus 9. And now we're in pico, which is minus 12. And we've gone beyond. And the thing is, we talked about conserving energy. And so that energy is conserved between the magnetical and gravitational field forces, which we call a MAGRAV condition. But you can pick your MAGRAV condition, and whatever it is, you have to know that there's an equal and opposite reaction that is balancing that out. And so as we change our physical points, we have to change our alignment, and that becomes our turning point. And then, of course, since we have many, many points, then we also have to have multiple turning points. And as we've discovered, these fields can overlap. And that gives us what we call the spice of life. It gives us the variety. And so when we talk about the conservation, we're talking about the conservation of inertia. That is when two fields come together and create the one. That creation, of course, is at a lower energy state. And so that becomes a MAGRAV energy transfer state. And how you transfer that energy is what we call susceptibility. So it all depends on the influences that are coming in. And so those influences can be allowed or disallowed. But we have a situation where we can either be in a different energy state and change your susceptibility to balance out the equation, or we can transcend from energy state to another energy state and still maintain that balance. And so this becomes a different kind of turning point. And that's what we have to really consider. So there's more than we've been allowing to enter into our life. And so that becomes your main point of view on how we do this dimension building. So we all have a point, and then we have a reference point by adding a second and connecting to that. But if we add a third, then we only need to connect two. And if we add a fourth, we need to connect three. And we've never said where this dimension building is. And so we would say, well, that's undifferentiated, right? It's not very specific. But what is specific is that it represents a star formation, and that star formation may be undifferentiated, but to exist, it has to have a magnetical gravitational relationship. So the gravitational is of a higher energy and the magnetical is of a lower energy. And in that process, there is a, shall we call it a midpoint? And that midpoint becomes differentiated. And how can it become differentiated when the creation of the star formation is undifferentiated? Well, it has to have a reference. So when we're looking at a star point, all we're seeing is the magnetical gravitational relationship. And then when we're looking at the Gans point, that becomes part of the Gans containment. And at that point, because of the energy flow, it becomes even more gravitational. So it goes right down to the core. And so many people like to do a core analysis. And so when we look at the star core component and we see that it's just a magnetical gravitational relationship, and then we have this polarity. So the basic core is the magnetical is the North Pole and the gravitational is the South Pole. But when you start to have a relationship, now you have to have a balance and you have to have a way of connecting. And so this necessitates binding points. How do you bind these forces together? So there are loose ends created. Well, where do they go? It just appears that they're just terminal ends. But are they? Or are they the seed point for another binding point? And that's what we have to take into account. So our schemes are too small. We have to enlarge our schemes and take more into the account. It's not just what is obviously in front of us. We need to see many more things. So what we talk about is the dynamic plasma relationship. So at the core is the horizontal transmission. And then polarity wise, there's a vertical transition. And so we create the basic Earth space point, and that point is within the Earth space field. Well, we do the same thing with our own physical point. We have our physical field, and we have our physical point within that field. And most of us depend on the words that we hear, which of course are created physically. But sometimes those words can be hurtful and they change our emotion. How is it possible for words to change your emotion unless you allow it? That's how. Because the words themselves are physical, and our emotions don't understand words. They understand feelings. And so when you engage in those feelings, you are now entering the plasma world. And so the turning point is for us to understand that there's a gravitational inertia point. When you bring these star core inertia points together, and there's no rope, there's no chain, but there is a binding point. But in order to manifest that binding point, it has to have a containment that is gravitational. And in order to do that, it has to be a rotating field. Well, that rotating field is the binding zone, but it also facilitates a turning point due to the nature of the fact that it is rotating. So your viewpoint can change. And how many times have you heard someone say, well, let's look at it this way, or let's look at it that way, or here's my point of view. But in the end, the question is, what is the correct point of view? Well, how do you determine that? So given a set of circumstances, there seems to be a better point of view. And when we review our life and we see that we've come to many turning points, many inflection points in our life, based on what we know at that point in time, we thought we made the best decision possible. And then we find that was the worst possible decision we could have made. And why is that? Because there were things that we didn't take into account. Either they were hidden from us, we were lied to, or we were deceived, or in the worst case, we were self-deceiving. We just didn't want to hear it. We wanted what we wanted, and we lived in denial. And as a result, we suffered the consequences. Well, that is the gravitational inertia point. So we become the products of our own existence. And so that affects our dimensional positioning. So trying to make this point, we're just saying it's undifferentiated because we're only taking into account book number 1, The Universal Order of Creation of Matters, and book number 1, also The Creation of Matters. And the connection of those two books is really this book number 2, The Structure of the Light. So we see that it's undifferentiated because, well, we just don't have a proper reference. It's not enough information there. and yet somehow we can exist. Okay, so we have to understand that when we do the dimension building, that each point has an overlap. And then there is a connection between those overlaps, and that creates the gravitational form. And it still is undifferentiated because you're just looking at the structure. And each of those points then becomes an inertia point, because to balance off that inertia point, to create that inertia point, there has to be a gravitational point and a magnetical point. And so those two create the inertia point. Now that can become differentiated, but we still don't know what it is because we are only looking at the basic connection. We're not taking into account the entire inertia point containment, which is to say, if we're looking at gravitational containment, so we're bringing three inertia points together to create the gravitational base. So you have the gravitational base, but what is the magnetical point? And where are you connected to? So we still haven't decided that. So we have overlapping points. We have overlap of a connection, and they are differentiated. And we go through, we know there's one dimension, then there's two-dimensional, then there's three-dimensional, and then we have the star dimensional, and then we have the observer dimensional. Well, that's us. Well, what are we observing? And if we're observing it, are we part of it? Well, the reality is that we cannot extricate ourselves from the universe to look at it. It isn't like, shall we say, taking your clothes off and checking to see if they're torn or tattered or if you fell in the mud. We cannot step outside of the universe. We are part of the universe. Doesn't matter where we are, in whichever dimension we are, we're the observers. So where are you looking? And so these inertia point containments, they basically become a convergent point or a divergent point, or it becomes a pivot point or a turning point. So what are we doing? This is a balance point between the intension and the extension. So that turning point is the tension point, and it is the binding point between two other fields. So we are talking about the concept of duality. We have to understand that it involves 2 points, and they work together as a partnership. And in the plasma science, we call it the twinity. But a singular point is not good enough. We have to bring together the inertia point containment fields. Now we are dealing with higher orders of magnitude. And then we have this dimension positioning. And so now when we look at book number 1 and the bringing together of the matter, well, now we can start asking, how do we differentiate? Because each of these points are inertia points coming from somewhere, going to somewhere, and interacting with something. And so we see how the variety is created. The basic understanding of dimensional positioning has been established. But now we have to understand that there is motion as well. And so how is this ray motion created? So when we look at natural creation, we have to understand that also there is natural decay. It's a two-way street. And if that is a two-way street, one street has to have the magnetical gravitational relationship. And if one street has that, then it has to be balanced off by the second street, which has a magnetical gravitational relationship, which is to say there's a natural decay and a natural creation on the other side of the tracks. And in between is the boundary. And since we really don't understand that, the way we have evolved in physicality, we fudge our knowledge. But the thing we can't fudge is that that is a bonding factor. So we have to understand that in order to conserve energy, there has to be a bond to balance off the equation. And so we have to understand that everything that we see in our physicality, whether it be stationary or whether it be in motion, is all part of the creation. And there's a balance that goes forth all the time. And so we've referenced to being like in a tent city. There's a range and there's tension. And so within is what we call intention, and without is what we call extension. So life is really the balance between our intention and extension. And that is to do with tension and with bonding. And then, of course, many tents create a city. And so humanity's goals really, by extension, deal with how we can intensify and extensify what we are. And so we are at that turning point. And to review polar axis flipping, one only needs to play with a top, a spinning top. And we've all played as children with that. And we kind of enjoyed it when we watched how it was wobbling or how it was clattering on the floor. But once it achieved a certain kind of speed, it was spinning in a perpendicular manner. It always stood up vertically. And then, of course, even we could do a complete flip. And in history, we talk about, well, the sun flipping and, of course, different kinds of spinning of the earth. We referenced it as earth upheaval. So what does that mean? Well, we just changed the relationship of the magnetical gravitational relationship. In other words, we put the gravitation at that core and we put the magnetical on the outside. So the gravitational point became the turning point. And why is that so hard to understand? Look at the creation of a vortex inside a container of water. So here we have a clear container and the water is spinning very rapidly. And you can see how it is at the bottom, a very narrow column of spinning water. But at the top, it's very broad. And then we look at a tornado. We call it a funnel cloud. It looks like a funnel, just like the water. The difference is the funnel cloud is in air. And it's broad at the top and pointy at the bottom. And then when we look at the star core polarity, what we termed was the gravitational ends up really being the magnetical. And the pointy part ends up being gravitational. But it's not. because when you start to bring in the two rotating fields, like poles repel. So the duality creation is at that turning point. And that in turn becomes gravitational. That is why. So, in other words, the turning point is the gravitational point, and the field above is the star magnetical, and the field below is the star magnetical. And then, how do you achieve that balance? So, we have to have a reference. So, we have multiple turning points. And so each inertia bonding point has to have a different polarity. So if we are taking these fields point to point, then we need a gravitational bonding field. But if we are putting these fields the base to base, then we need a magnetical bonding field. And so we see that there is an opposite polarity as it goes along. Opposites attract. And so each of these bonding points become turning points, but they all work together despite the fact that they're opposite poles. And so as a result, we have multiple turning points. And then if we look across and we see that in these three diagrams, we have two gravitational points. And how do they come together in the center? There has to be an opposite pole. In this case, it has to be a magnetical pole. And so, interestingly enough, we have a magnetical pole at the core. Well, there's an anomaly. So, how does that work? So, if we are looking at half the picture and we're looking at the carbon inertia highways, so as we said, we had the transmission highway, which is the carbon 12, the transition to carbon 14, and the transmutation carbon 16. But then we see that each point has to have a relationship, a magnetical gravitational relationship. So we've introduced the duality. And that gives us what we call the variability, which is created through the action of susceptibility. Well, which point? There are multiple turning points, and that's only half the picture. And that is, generally speaking, the picture that we see. But there is another part of the picture, and it too has multiple turning points. So now we have half the picture with multiple turning points, and the other half of the picture with multiple turning points. And they converge, and they diverge, and they all are variable based on susceptibility. But the conservation of energy remains. So what we're dealing with is what we call residency. That residency is determined by location. That's what the real estate agents always say, right? Location, location, location. Well, what is your location? So that implies a physical location. However, there is an energy state location, such as the solid state, the water state, the liquid state, the air state, the plasma state, the energy state. And then there's a way to track, but also there's a way to filter. And so as all these fields are moving around, and you say, well, if you can't track it, you're just going to get dizzy. So geologists like to do a core analysis, right? They do an assay, which is they take a core sample, which cuts through the layers. And we know that these layers are overlapping turning points. So wherever you look, you can see a layer, and yet each layer is a maggrav condition. In other words, it has a magnetical gravitational relationship, and then that relationship has a neighbor, which also has a magnetical gravitational relationship, and then these two work together in another relationship. And you say, well, what does that have to do with me? Well, what kind of relationship do you have with your neighbor? Or what kind of relationship do you have with your partner? Or what kind of relationship do you have with your children? So these are all polar pathways. So you can look at it the equator point of view, which is the fundamental turning point, or you can look at it at the polar point of view, which there's a North Pole and there's a South Pole. They are opposite poles, but they also are opposite points of view. So if we look at the rotating base and we say, okay, well, there's a turning point, and that is the foundation. That is the rotating base. Well, the question then is, how do you achieve this polar point? And so we see that there's a perpendicular action which is pushing in both directions simultaneously because of the conservation of energy, the balance, where equality is equal in all directions. And so we create this rotating field. And so as the turning point is rotating, then there's an expansion towards the poles, and there's an interaction there. And so now these turning points become fat rotating fields, and they expand. So that gives you one reference point. So then you have multiple turning points, and the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. And how do you determine that? Well, the point is that there are no two equal points in existence at the same time. But they do have a common denominator. And that common denominator is the NP junction point. So when we take three dimensions and we say, well, this is the X, Y, and Z axis dimension, part of the transition matter, and let's designate that as the negative charge. And then we have the X, Y, and Z axis of another track, and let's designate that transition matter as a positive charge. And then the relationship between those two fields create this transfer state, which is the inertia point. It is the junction point, the negative positive junction point, the bringing of these two fields together. So there you have one track. And so you have this progression. We started with the nano point and we moved towards density, right? The nano point is 10 to the minus ninth, smaller than 1. And then the pico point, which is highly gravitational, was 10 to the minus 12th. Then you had the Gans point, which moved towards the gaseousness, which is a really big point because it encapsulated that point and expanded. And then you have the plasma point, which goes beyond that, and that is highly magnetical. So these fields and these residencies are either power drawing, where we have the gravitational intensity, or they're power providing, which are giving out the magnetical out tensity. So now we understand the conservation of energy. It is all based on the balance between the magnetical gravitational conservation of the maggrav. So maggrav on one side or some maggrav on the other side. All the maggrav points in between indicate the susceptibility and therefore can be balanced. And it all depends on your state of residency. And so we have this energy portability, which can go from energy state transition. And so we say in the science, elevation is a physical matter state to energy state. elevation, and inertia is an energy state to physical matter state transition. And so elevation involves expansion. And isn't it interesting? Expansion on both the magnetical and gravitational side. Now we understand the power of the plasma science and its capability of achieving energy portability. So we start with the inertial products, which is a transition within a range, or it can go from range to range, or it can go from state to state. But as we say with the water splitting, where the pH always totals 14, you have many different potentiation layers in between. And we can change this either due to causticity or by creating an unstable energy transition state. So it either brings or it takes energy away. And this is even how hydrogen has a fundamental dependency. And it isn't until you get involved with advanced science that you understand that there's an orthohydrogen and a parahydrogen, and either one is in balance. And either one is established with a covalent bond. But on one case, the poles are common, and on the other case, the poles are opposite, but they're still in balance because they are on both sides of the equation. The hydrogen itself is the turning point. And from there, we have a periodic table of switchboards, right? Because each and every element, which represents the Earth space range details, manifests from this turning point. And depending on its falling, its angular density, it affects the mass. And so that's how we have the periodic table of elements established. So the pH stairway of both these poles is the elevation through causticity or the inertia through maggrav positioning. Everything in between are potentiation plasma layers. So wherever you are, well, there you are. And so we see that the nuclear feeding inertia, whether it's a fragment of the complexity or it's the whole, is gravitationally stable and dimensionally portable, and it goes from different points. And so when we see the universal order of creation of book number 1, find the bringing together of the antimatter, dark matter, and matter state, where 1 + 1 + 1 is more than 3, because in order to maintain that inertia, there has to be a continuous nuclear feeding. So we have the nuclear feeding and we have the inertia, and it's continuing. So nothing is sacrificed because we have the equilibrium. You cannot be more equal than somebody else. That just defies the whole definition of equality. And the nuclear feeding does not allow that. So there are maggrav pathways where we have the attraction field forces, which we call gravity intensity, and that's our feedback. And so we see how the electron operates, and then we have the repulsion forces of the magnetical outintensity, and that's part of the feeding. And the higher strength feeds, and so that's the action of the neutron. So what is our point of view? Is our point of view from the feeding, or is it from the feedback? Well, we have to understand that both are involved continually. And so when we steal, lie, cheat at the expense of others, that is not feeding. That is not nourishing. That is minimizing. And so which side of the tracks are you on? And so when we look at the undifferentiated beginning, we say, okay, well, the neutron came before the atom and the PM tape, right? With the neutron, it created the proton and electron marriage combination, which we call the atom. But there was a loss of energy, and that energy is another energy pack, which we call the PM tick. And this is the energy that transcends the universe. So when we say, oh, well, let there be light, well, that came from somewhere else. And it came to come from darkness. That has to come from within. And so when we look at what we see as the light, we only notice that because everything else is dark. So let's remember that that which is dark has to be light on the other side. And that's the part of the thing that we're missing. And that's why we have this undifferentiated beginning, because we don't understand how the principal matter, which we talked about, these PM ticks, which are magnetical, and they're energy packs, and they come together as antimatter, dark matter, and the matter gen, and go through this plasma gen conversion. So it has to have a MAGRAV condition. But in order to manifest it physicality, it has to have a relationship. So all of us have chosen Earth. And since Earth itself also created a MAGRAV condition, because Earth had to be here before we got here, so the Earth created its field interaction of inertia, and we, in terms of physicality, created our field interaction inertia, and we only manifest in the physicality when we interacted with the MAGRAV condition of the inertia of the physicality of the Earth. Which means if we change that relationship, then things would have to change. But knowingly, they would change within balance. So we are plasma creatures. And in order to be somewhere or to exist, we have to have a balancing energy. So one side is gravitational, the other side is plasmatic. And is it side by side? Or as we see our bodies, where we have a brain, which follows the rules of the universal cup of the universe, or we have our physicality, which follows the cup of the emotion and the cup of physicality? Or is it fabricated as a rotating field? And here we are at the turning point where we create this dimension point, the coming together of the magnetical gravitational field forces. And we have the plasma energy at our core. So at that core, what we see in our practicality is the matter plasma dimension, where we have this physical, where we can touch it and see it, but we also have this plasmatic, which we can't touch or we can't see. But we know it's there because we feel the emotion, we feel the love, or we have other emotional feelings. But the thing is, these are all part of the matter plasma, and so we depend on that. We've grown accustomed to depending on that, so we become feedback dominant because these are all part of the feedback, forgetting that we were born through the feeding component of the plasma dimensions, which were beyond the matter plasma. And that energy came to us through the feeding. Once we got to the Earth space, we decided to alter that feeding. Instead of being an energy feeding, we adopted a food feeding. And when that didn't work, then we opted to a stealing from our neighbors feeding. So look at the way the universe had this gravitational conformation. We have the hydrogen. It came from the universe and made these magnetical gravitational connections. and it was manifest into light because we see it. There's an emission spectrum that identifies the fingerprint of hydrogen. And so wherever in the universe we're looking for that fingerprint, we have the gravitational tracking. And the same thing happens with oxygen. And it has an emission spectrum and it's manifest from light, but its fingerprint is different. So we still have the gravitational tracking and it is unique. And then each of these tracking devices exposes a dimensional seed, which is at the root of the star formation. And that becomes the turning point. That becomes the dimensional star formation. And we only see the magrav's singularity that comes from all of these points in the star formation. But we have to look at the Peace Dome reactors, which gives us either a shielding, which is a dimension point, or it gives us a star positioning, which is a dimension point, or which gives us a possession, such as gold, another dimension point. So we have multiple turning points. And as we demonstrated in Beijing on May the 10th, we could convert these dimensional seed points into gold. And it came from thin air. We did that in public. It's on the internet. Everyone can see it. And this was a show of singularity because this technology was obsolete. The foundation has moved well in advance. We can produce gold by the ton. So if we connect the dots, what we're looking for is practical points. So for us that we can make practical reasoning. So are we on the road to self-determination, or are we on the road from self-determination? So what we're looking for is a practical philosophy, practical solutions for our practical currencies of life, the life-giving forces that are fundamental to our existence, that are worth more than money. And then the humanity inertia, GAN's shielding points that shield us from hostiles and from aggression, from environmental harm, from fear-mongering, or from emotional abuse. We're in uncharted territory, and you are the turning point. We're all many stars beyond the nano monatomic state, covering the range from decay to radiation. And what we're manifesting is our ancestral intelligence. We are the technology. We are the inertia point. And you are the image of your dimensional convergence point. There is a soul food. Tune into it. Plug into the creator. You've always been plugged into the creator, but just turn on that acceptance and drop out of that resistance. Receive that. That becomes your inertia point. And understand that you provide the pattern, and it is from that pattern that you get the energy, so you get to choose. And it's for 600 Knowledge Seekers workshops. That's 600 Thursdays in a row for over 11 years. We have been trying to suddenly transcend the limitations of nuclear science and bringing together the greater oneness of the teachings of the Keshe Foundation, Spaceship Institute. And now we are in the post May the 10th of 2025, barely 2 months ago, bringing together the Keshe Space Plasma research teams. We were looking for the first ones. Well, no one else can be first anymore. We are only at the beginning of the session, and we have many more things to do to bring peace and prosperity to this planet. So we're looking at technology releases because it's hard to sleep when our beds are burning. We involve and require rescues that are scientific, financial, political, and affect the preservation, not only of who we are, but why we came here. We didn't come here without any purpose. And so we are continuing the transmutation testing to understand how our soul is functioning. So you're welcome to join in August, September, and October to learn how to transmute again and understand that the connection between book number 1, where we have the coming together of the 3 different energy states and the origin of the universe, which is where the 1 splits up into 2, and we are the observers. Are we the observers in the 4th dimension? Is there more? Our mission is to bring peace on earth and join humanity with the universal community. We want to bring man as equal to all the beings in the universe by teaching the plasma science and technology equally to everyone, that no one is left out and no one is abused due to lack of knowledge. Please help us achieve this goal. It isn't just our goal, it's your goal as well. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings of Plasma Science, welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers of the carbon nations, learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science. Yep, there's a world peace treaty. Choose it, sign it, and mean it sincerely. The point of true nanotech is to cross these atomic boundaries which we've created. The peace dome of outer space can be your guiding beacon. Is the inertia of the present governed by dimensions of history? It is time to learn the history of self in a universal context. A peaceful self can explore many inertia levels as a superconductor. The turning point is the dominant emotional point between our belief and our experience. And plasma science needs to continue to be delivered daily via the Peace Dome in a practical exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new golden outer space age. And that's the end of the class, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex, for sharing more and more. But the more you share, the deeper it seems to go. This is just unbelievable. I'm going to stay quiet for a moment and let's see if any of the participants would like to raise a question. And it doesn't have to be a perfect question. It can be something you've been pondering on, or doesn't have to be a softball question either. You can take exception with what Alex has said, or again, test it. So let's see if any of the participants has a question that's been on their mind or something they wanted addressed. Over to the participants.
Alex, thanks for the teaching. Question we were talking about before previously. How do you transfer emotions to someone?
Most of us have a problem understanding that. That's a tough question that you're asking. Most of us have empathy, and as a result of that empathy, we adopt or absorb the energy that someone else is leaking with. And then in that process, we kind of take on this baggage and we accept it because it becomes a badge of honor where you see how empathetic I am. I am, supporting this group and that group, and I'm wearing the T-shirt and I'm protesting in the streets, and what are you achieving? So everything that we're doing in that regard is the physical reaction to that emotional impetus. So can we change the impetus? And since the soul is changing everything and the soul is directing all the energy, then the soul is always truthfully providing the energy. So where do we go wrong? Why are we ignoring the provider and interpreting what is getting provided? It's like the chef makes a meal. And I said, well, how did you enjoy that meal? Did you enjoy that meal? As if they're begging for confirmation. Well, the thing is that the feedback that you're getting from that meal is in the mind of the person who ate the meal. And, you know that you're a good chef and you know that you created a good meal, but it is entirely possible that you deliver this meal and someone says, oh my God, that is the worst meal I've ever had in my life. And so you're looking at an individual's point of view. So what is that person experiencing? And are they being truthful? Is it really that your meal is not good, or is it that they are just, demonstrating what is going on in their life and passing it on to that meal? So what we need to do is to not engage with that. So that part, we don't need to carry that baggage. What we do need to do is work on our true intent. So if you are the chef and if you are preparing a meal, then you want to prepare it with the true intent. And that is, obviously, you want to make it delicious. You want it to be nourishing. You want the person to enjoy it. And that is all you can do, because nothing anyone does or says can make you do or feel anything unless you allow it. So what you want is only half the picture. What the other party does is the other half of the picture. So if you are giving a good meal, they have to be willing to accept that. And then if they are satisfied with that, what would their intention be with? Well, let me think. They would wish to somehow convey that notion to you that they are well satisfied with what you intended and to acknowledge that you have succeeded. And there's many ways to do that. You can give a tip, you can give a compliment, or you can revisit that restaurant. So if you're in sync with that, like all the members of this panel, we see that they didn't come here to listen to me or to Mark. Everyone here wants to know how to convey this information in a constructive manner to another, be it a family member, be it a neighbor, or be it a world leader. Because that denotes responsibility. So a world leader has a different responsibility from the head of the household. But responsibility nevertheless, and the intention remains the same. So this is
That's so that's
what
the so that intention. i- i- if I look at intention as fields and emotion as magnetic fields in motion. I asked that because when Mr. Cash mentioned that the new technologies is going after our emotions directly. Old technology will elevate our soul, but for the technology to go after our emotions directly, so where it can affect our emotions directly, how how is it possible? And I still trying to understand it as in a plasma sense to have in our physical body to transfer emotions. What type of energy can we go? Can we put to out there in a goal to affect someone else's emotion without elevating their soul to where their soul will go down to them, but it goes straight to their emotion and they display that same emotion that you wanted to transfer. Case in point, when somebody yawns, somebody's beside will automatically yawn. Unconsciously, we transfer that emotion. It feels the same way a dog will yawn. Sometimes humans will yawn and the dog will stay young. I look at that as that's the emotions transfer. So how can we consciously, not unconscious, consciously control and transfer that emotion if we have intentions as fields?
If,
So that's a great question.
if
So
you're
let's
elevated,
differentiate.
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Mark, did you want to?
No, I was gonna say first to Ike's question, we don't force feed it. Then I went back to the transcript where he said, you grab the leg, you hold the head, and you force feed the child to take that medicine because you know it's good for it.
Yes, because we need to have people to not to be, you know,
I'm thinking
killers.
if you're
Right.
elevated, that would automatically transfer if the soul wants to pick it up.
But this time around, he's going direct to the emotions. So we have no control of it. So it's like kind of like force feeding us to do good.
Well, we do have control of it. And the first thing that we have to understand is that in terms of wording, it's just so that we can understand it in a practical sense. So we say that the soul gets elevated. But in reality, the soul doesn't need elevation. It is already operating at the elevated level. But the soul is manifest within a Magrav condition that is earthbound and is trying to communicate with its physicality. And the intermediate, of course, is the solar physicality. So the solar physicality operates on the same basis. The problem is, of course, that the solar physicality is now fed from the emotion of the universe and it's fed from the emotion of the soul, and it's also getting the feedback from the physicality. And that feedback is very, very important because the soul of the physicality is the monitor, is the equalizer, is the one who is dispersing more of what you need and eliminating more of what you don't need. However, when we abdicate that responsibility and we transfer that to the physicality, well, then the physicality says, well, what I see is what I get. And so the physicality becomes feedback dominant and basically shuts off the entire communication. So what we are doing is enhancing the energy state of that communication, so providing more of it. So the soul, in fact, is no longer bound within that earthbound limitation with respect to the energy that it is absorbing, but it now has a bigger, shall we say, buffet of energy to draw from. And as such, it is more powerful. And as such, it creates a more welcoming. It still is up to the individual to accept that welcoming. But the thing is that the welcoming is inherently welcome. It's when those who are hardened over the ages, who have completely suppressed their engagement, and they have set up a shield where they totally do not want to accept that, because for them, the attribute of having power is an addiction. And whether they know it or not, by elevating to a higher energy state, they would lose that addiction. And those who are aware are bound and determined to avoid that at all costs. So this is where we are in terms of the threshold between those who are, shall we say, deceived. So their resistance is weak. And once you give enough, just like a sandcastle is very, is very structural. And along comes a wave and, oh, it's back to sand. Well, that's what these people are like. And they will very easily absorb that energy and it will be welcome. So this is for them, because 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, they are bombarded with a, shall we say, a psychological, emotional roller coaster of energy, and it is consuming. And in that process, people who attach to that consumption get weaker, they leak. So we need to plug the holes. We need to bail the water. We need to keep the ship afloat. And we need to understand that what keeps us going is the energy of the universe, not the people who are rowing the boat. The boat will move on its own as long as we enlist the services of the higher power. When we drop down to a lower energy state, then we've reduced our capability by orders of magnitude. And it's many orders of magnitude. So just 2 is 10 times 10 is already 100. No wonder so many of us are weak and frail and wilting under the onslaught of this emotional overbearance. So that's the emotion that we engage in our physicality, but there's an emotion that we engage in with the universe. And one is bountiful and full of vitality, and the other one is compromised. So we need a little supercharging, a little superconducting. And we have now developed a system that will replicate that energy of the universe. If I may add to your question, my question is, since humanity has been made out to be inferior, in other words, that there are superior races out there, my question is, why are these superior races so superior? And if they are so superior, how come we still have these problems? And they are not exclusively our problems, they are their problems as well. So it means that none of us have graduated, not in this dimension. And so we need to elevate the energy that is flowing within this dimension so that we can all get nourished. Thank you very much, Ike.
Okay, anyone else have a thought or a question they'd like to join the conversation with? I was just pondering about this galaxy that we're in. And anyone have an idea of how many stars are in our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy? Remember, there was a problem with the soul that created our star. I'm wondering if it's been isolated perhaps just to this particular galaxy. Is there 100 billion stars, 300 billion stars? Is this sort of a weak point of creation in the universe where souls that are not fully elevated actually are within this galaxy and can create a star? Obviously, our star has been created with a weak point or a flaw in it. And we know that crossing galaxies from one galaxy to another takes a special knowledge. And not all stars do create solar systems. But I'm just wondering if it was isolated and it's just in this part of the universe where our galaxy is that this condition exists. And so we will have a lot of work to do within our own galaxy in a way to correct the situation, because many souls that have left this planet are doing exactly the same as the sun has, or our star. That could be a couple 100 billion solar systems, let's say, that need some sort of correction. Maybe not all of them, maybe just a few. It was just something I thought about. And maybe, again, as I said, they're not allowed to cross between galaxies. That takes a special understanding or special knowledge to do. So maybe it's confined to this area, but yet there's still a lot of work to do to correct the souls that have gone out and started the creation on the wrong foot, let's say. Didn't have all the mojo it needed to create a perfect system.
So I'm like you, Mark. I have limited knowledge with respect to that, but from what we're gathering from the plasma science, I think we can conclude that we're working at a slight disadvantage, and it seems to be isolated to this part of the universe.
Right.
And
if you have an abscess on your foot, the other foot still works fine, the hands work fine, but you have to deal with that abscess on the one foot.
see, and that's what's important. What you just did was you try to relate this in a practical, physical basis. And this is what I was saying earlier on. We have the context of a turmoil in the physicality, turmoil in the liquid state, the gaseous state, and of course we have the turmoil in the plasma state. So all of this is to show us how life works and how the energy is exchanged. So it only stands to reason that the creation was created using the same rules, because we are able to create even things in our physicality. It's just that we seem to emphasize more on the physical state because we are not seeing the exchange of energy on a plasmatic level. So what we have to understand is that every single thing that we have is a physical manifestation based on an inertia binding of two other plasmatic fields. Every physical point is a physical manifestation of an inertia point. But because we can just grab that point and we can ram it somewhere else, then we feel that we have the power to work on that. So case in point, you can hold a battery in your hand, but that battery has an energy gradient, and that gradient is not activated until you put it in a circuit. So therefore, you don't take the energy and put it in a circuit, you take the battery and you put it in a circuit. Now you've completed the whole circuit. Now you have directed the energy in motion in the physical state to go through its lowest transition through the wiring. But the energy rules are the same in the plasma state. It's just that we have a different type of wiring. We have a plasmatic wiring. So that means we have to change our awareness. That is the first step. Then the second step is, how do we convey the knowledge of that awareness to someone
Alex,
who
you just,
never heard it before? Go
sorry,
ahead.
you just try to describe plasma computer because you, if you have uh that energy, like you said, how do you make that connection to stay in a plasma dimension?
Well, it follows the same rules. There's a magnetico-gravitational containment. So until enough energy comes in to change the susceptibility, it is either going to stay within that containment or it is going to go outside of that containment. But that containment has to have a relationship with its environment, whether that environment is on a planet, in your kidney, or in the universe.
And that's what's lacking in electronics.
Well, electronics is the physical manifestation of energy transfer. Then you have
But
the nuclear science, which is of a higher energy state.
but is the environment part of that entire process? Because what you just said kind of makes sense. With plasma, the environment is part of the process.
Of
But
course.
with electronics, is the environment is not part of this process.
Of course it is. You designed the circuit board. You designed the radio. You designed the computer. And then you either put in a power supply, right? Which now you are drawing energy from another point of creation, say the grid, or you use a battery, which is drawing energy from within the battery. And that energy does not move through the circuit until you install the battery within the circuit. So the installation of that energy in the circuit is either by inserting a battery into the circuit or plugging in to a circuit. Well, that is the physical wiring. However, the rules are the same when you go into the plasma state. When you touch your cell phone with your finger, there is no wire between your finger and the surface of the cell phone, and yet you have the power to call someone or to order some food. Yeah, you don't have the power to make it, but when your finger, you have the power to order someone to deliver it. You better have the power to pay for it. But you know, we are not amazed by that capability, but yet, we are not understanding how that energy is transferred. So we have a card it's either a debit card or a credit card, and it has a little chip on it. And we kind of hover over a part of the uh, point of sale machine. And it will actually, you don't even have to touch it. You just hover over it, and it will withdraw money from your account, whether it's debit or whether it's a credit. And we think it's normal. We think nothing of it. And yet here we are. I don't understand the plasma science. You don't understand the transference of energy. So, and as this is, you see this action, and it sometimes manifests as abuse, and that becomes, there's a physical abuse, but there's an emotional abuse. And so, what was the reference that Mark was demonstrating today? Do you have less wrinkles on your face? Why? Because those wrinkles either represent an aging, a physical aging, or it represents a manifestation that comes from abuse. So if you drop that baggage, then you don't have to have the wrinkles on your face. There's no rule that says you have to have wrinkles. There's no rule that says you have to be old and decrepit. And that rule has been broken because we have so many young people who are decrepit. Look at the statistics of those who are under 30, or how about the statistics of those who are under the age of 5? And you say, like, what happened to old and decrepit? They don't belong in the same sentence. We just artificially put it in the same sentence. Well, you're old, you must be decrepit. So you better get the cane. You're going to need a cane. Well, where's the rule that says you have to have a cane? Well, now we're coming up with new rules. Why can a salamander regrow a limb? What's our problem? We're so mighty. We're so powerful, right? We have the technology, but we can't grow limbs, but a salamander can. So don't say it's not possible. Just say we don't understand. And we're not trying to figure it out, are we? We're too busy working to make a living. Did I answer your question, Ike?
Yes, it's more of it.
Did he say more or less?
Well,
No, I said more of it. That's it's more questions, more intriguing.
Alex or anyone else, are you kind of curious about this fountain of youth that Mr. Kesh was talking about, increasing the half-life? I know I played a little bit with an apple and tried to increase its half-life. As you said, Alex, as you increase the half-life, the wrinkles disappear. You can become much younger physically and in your behavior. You can apparently set the time. Anyone thinking about this? Isn't this what we were looking for in a way, some sort of immortality?
Yeah, but what affects our, shall we say, our physicality is that when we start to lose our mobility, like in terms of being, as I referenced, being decrepit or having to have a cane or, being bent at the hip or something like that, then the will to live in terms of the physicality begins to diminish. And the question really is that the true will of the soul? And it's interesting when you look at a couple that have been together for many, many years. And this is a true story. I've seen one where he was very, very ill and aged, and she was vibrant and, very active. And you say, well, this is a husband and wife. They don't look, see, the thing about a family is that if you were to say, well, they are experiencing a certain kind of emotional thing, well, wouldn't you think that the husband and the wife would share that emotion? Or if you were, looking at a dietary thing, well, don't you think the husband and the wife would eat from the same meal? Or you would look at it as an environmental fact. Well, wouldn't the husband and the wife live in the same environment? So then the next experiment, of course, is to separate them. And then what happens? One thrives and the other one wilts. Why? Is it possible that the one who wilted was drawing the energy from the other one, and then once the other one was relieved of that leaking, suddenly kept that energy, and then as such began to thrive? That kind of explains a lot, doesn't it? So here we have practical applications, practical examples, in our social structure. And this is what we have to incorporate. We don't have to bring everything in, with a body enhancement unit. We can all participate in this because we have everything that we need. We just have to accept it and acknowledge it. But how are you going to do that when you have so many intermediaries? So we have to transcend that. So the answer is you cannot play on that field. You have to go to another field where they can't play. Okay, so you're talking about residency. What field are you resident in? Right?
Yeah, and I was thinking again about what Ike said about transferring the emotion. They say certain people, they come into the room and they just light up the whole room, or
Right.
they become the life of the party. This is what happened with Christ, I think. Everybody just became elevated while he was in the room. This is why they wanted to be around him and listen, especially the women, for other reasons. But anyway, this is what happens as you are elevated. It's automatically radiated out without you saying a word. The souls pick it up. The physicality is probably scratching their head saying, what's going on? But I'm enjoying it. This is great. So as we become those satellites, I think this is what's going to happen. And you may be connected to a system in part of the planet somewhere, perhaps in Europe, as he said. We only need one system. So if you're connected to that system and the energy is being, in a way, channeled through you or brought through you as that satellite, you'll beam that out. And this will bring the change to the others without saying a word to them. He does seem like he wants to do a huge, rapid elevation of humanity in a very short time. This is what he always said, and I could never understand. How is he going to elevate all the inhabitants in a single go or in a very short period of time? But he said, look in the next few weeks how this is going to start manifesting itself. Again, it may take longer depending on how much the governments want to get involved in this whole process. And this is why we continue to elevate the world leaders, that they don't have to confirm their existence by killing and confining people. But we need a collective awareness of humanity to help with that process. And of course, there's systems in place and other things with the universal community and the sun. That's all contributing to the overall process of this elevation.
So that's the point that you made. We are looking to establish peace and prosperity equally across this planet. And why are we not getting the why are we not getting the universal support, shall we say? So the point of the matter is that we're looking for the peace and prosperity on a certain energy state, and the resistance is on that energy state. So if we go to a higher energy state, that resistance is no longer there. So by amplifying that, we are now delivering more, and then we get the result. So we have to understand that the higher feeds the weaker. So you don't beef up the weaker, you beef up the higher, and you're able to give more. And when you give more, you get more. That's the rule.
So what you were saying in space, when two entities come together, the stronger feeds the weaker, but yet you said there's still going to be a difference between the two entities, let's say. But I thought that's where you are creating that MAGRAV condition, that you elevate the weaker equal to you or even above you.
Yeah, but don't look at the totality of that MAGRAV condition. There are parts of that MAGRAV that are stronger and weaker. So the common denominator is where the stronger feeds the weaker. Now, there is no rule that says that the weaker has to feed back to the stronger. Now that the weaker is being fed by the stronger, that weaker can then in turn feed to another who is still weaker. Okay, so it isn't just a two-way street on one street. It's one way this way, it's another way that way, and then there's another field that comes in this way and goes back that way. So you're looking at a vast grid of two-way streets, and you can pick and choose which ones you want to go. So if the one street is blocked, well, then you're going to go another way. It's perfectly normal, isn't it? And then when you go the other way, you'll be able to be more effective. Well, that's what we're doing. Why work on the blockage? Work on the success of transferring the energy. Then when that happens, you'll find that maybe what is causing the blockage will be relieved.
Okay, let's go back to our well-informed panelists. They're all very, as they say, erudite. Are there any other points, even a point that you would like to bring across? Doesn't have to be a question, doesn't have to be a comment. You can share the way you understand or what you think you understand with us. Any feedback from our latest guest, Samsung? Let's see if anything has touched, or is this a mystery? I'm still wondering how did you find this through another knowledge seeker, or did your soul lead you here? How did that all happen? Blair?
Well, in the physicality, I invited him,
Perfect.
but
I'm still here, gentlemen. And,
Are you still friends with Alex Samsung?
yeah, just call me Samsung. Shorten it to Sam. But no, I've listened to everything, and I mean, of course, I'll reserve my questions right now when I get together with Alex. It's very, very intriguing. And you know, I think Alex will tell you I do share my feedback, my input. So that's going to be our next get together. But thank you for inviting me, gentlemen. I've enjoyed the presentation.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard many things you've never heard before, but we're all trying to sort it out in a way. So we're in the same position as you.
Yes, you know, certain concepts are, you know, beyond my realm, and certain things that I can piece together. You know, I've been around a little bit, so certain things I can piece together. And then, of course, when I get um, Alex breaking it down to tiny little nano points for me with his narrative, it makes more sense to me. So
Yeah,
Thank you
that's what
very
we're
much.
doing, a new science, a new ethos, and a new language on this planet.
yes, yes, ethos, pathos. Yeah, very, very, very interesting, John. It certainly does open my eyes, and I think anybody would tell you that's has come on board and listen to your workshops that all through life and life's process, some of these things that we're talking about, these occurrences we've questioned, but I think politically put, we're so damn busy in our lives that so
Absolutely.
much we miss. So
Absolutely. I mean, just the concept of the stronger feeding the weaker is really alien to us, isn't it? Where, we
well,
always heard the big fish eats the little fish, without a doubt. This is the way it works.
it's ironically you said that because I was going to say it works in reverse in reality. So
Yeah.
the big dog wants to stay on top and suppress everybody. So I think the universal message is, you were mentioning about the higher powers, and then there is going to be resistance because there's a lot of leaders out there that don't want to share this. They don't want anybody to have this knowledge, uh, and they just want to be on top, and they want to be able to have all the control and all the power. So this would probably be very some of these foreign adversaries are, they're going to look at this and some are going to feel threatened. But I'm already talking too much. You guys got me talking too much. But
Oh, that's
yeah,
beautiful. Very beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
well, thank you.
Well, I want to thank everybody for allowing me to continue to present as we're trying to keep up with the advent of the technology, but you know, the progress has to carry on because the job is ongoing. Life continues to live, and every day the sun comes up, and now we know how it comes up and why it comes up. So it gives unconditionally. So we need to understand that that is our purpose as well. And at that point, it should give us all internal strength. So thank you, everybody. And I hope you enjoyed it. I'll still be here for further questions, but I'm going to pass it over to you, Mark.
Anyone else? Anything else you'd like to share? I know somebody was talking about soaps earlier. And again, there's going to be a whole line of resin products as well as soaps. And so many things. As he said, this store will go into the 30,000, 50,000, maybe even more products as the research centers open up and different people start to put different aspects together. I think, again, from lip balm to dog food to many of the other things. Maybe they'll even have plasmatic devices where you can feed your dog without the matter state, perhaps.
Where
As
are
he
you
said,
going? I'll give you a lift.
hello?
Absolutely. Oh, my apologies, gentlemen.
Thank you.
I missed that.
Oh, there's someone else who's listening in. So this is great. It's wonderful. Another Canadian joins our team.
Good. It's the same knowledge across the planet. It may be spoken in different field strengths and different languages, but it's the same knowledge. This is why it's so easy to work with someone else from a different country or something on this knowledge, because it's basically the same, even though we may understand it slightly differently. But this is bringing us all together under this plasma, this huge understanding of plasma technology, which again, I've always said I probably understand 1 billionth of 1 billionth of 1% of this. This is how vast the knowledge, the universal knowledge is compared to man's knowledge.
So we all know the power of the picotech.
We do.
You're getting more powerful, Mark. Thanks so much for all you do.
All of us. It's not just me, for sure. I'm just a latecomer into the foundation, but it certainly has satisfied my emotion of trying to get peace. As I said, I used to do some citizen lobbying in Washington with other groups, and again, trying to change the matter state with the matter state, everything. And we had beautiful proposals for energy, for food and feeding, all in the physical dimension, but yet it was all resisted. So now we work in the energy dimension, which again, we don't have to meet physically with them. We don't have to make phone calls. We don't have to do protests. If humanity realized how powerful of a, let's say, a low energy reactor they are, a field generator, we could bring the change. And it doesn't even have to be the entire humanity. It just needs to hit a certain point that, again, the physicality follows the energy dimension.
Turning point.